All right. So hi everyone. My name is Giles. Does anybody know what Mame is?
No, what's that?
Okay. So
it's what we do to people who don't know.
Ken asked me to come and talk because he recognized that this project has been going on for a long time, and there are some people on the project who just don't stop working on it, and I'm one of them. And so kind of wanted to know why and what makes us tick. So I put together a little something. We'll see how it goes. I've never done this kind of thing before. So where I work, if your presentation looks fancy and has animations, then you're not an engineer. But I'm an engineer, so my presentation will look like that. It's a point of pride. So, just in case somebody didn't know what Mame was, this emulator thing that we work on. So really the thing is, the goal of Mame at the highest level, what it does is it takes arcade hardware and writes computer software that behaves the same way. The idea is that you use the original media, the original ROMs and disks and various other media that are used to contain programs and graphics and sound, and you read those in this computer program and simulate all the chips, all the behaviors, all the internals of what was going on in that arcade cabinet. And one thing that's important to know about Mame is that it's developer focused. That is, it's not very user friendly. I mean, it's got menus, but they're not like nice menus. It doesn't really like to use the mouse, it's keyboardy. So, you know, a lot of the complaints that I hear about Mame is it's hard to use. I don't understand how to do it, and it's kind of intentionally that way. In part because our goal is really to make it easy to understand how the hardware works, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. There's really two projects in Mame. There's one which is figure out how all this hardware worked. So we've got 30 years of arcade games covering a large amount of history, and there's a lot of cool stuff in them. And we want to figure out how it works because we're just that kind of people. And that's really our first motivation. We're the kind of people who like to go in and figure out how things work. Then there's recently, I'd say within the last 5 or 6 years, it's kind of also become a project to design a software architecture for emulation. So we're not the only people who like to emulate stuff. I mean, and not even just games. So you look at games, you think, okay, games, arcade games, great. And you know, people, console emulators, I'm sure all you guys know about that kind of stuff. But, you know, Library of Congress is starting to look into how to preserve old documents, you know, from the VisiCalc documents and old, Word 1.0 documents. Now, there are two ways you can do that. One is you can keep converting them to newer and newer formats, but every time you do that, you lose something. Conversion is never perfect. The alternative is you run an emulator and you load the original document into the original program running on the emulator. And if you do your emulator right, in theory, you haven't lost anything. You still have the original in its original form. And so it goes beyond that. There are people who rely on emulation. You look at companies like Apple, they've done emulation for a number of years. They transitioned across 3 processor architectures and kept a whole lot of stuff going. That's all due to emulation. So it's a broader thing, and Mame, as a result, arcade hardware is incredibly diverse. That's the happy thing about it. Arcade hardware is incredibly diverse. And when you look at the collection of arcade hardware, you're like, wow, we really have emulated practically every CPU, every sound chip invented in the last 30 years. Why not make that a little easier to assemble into something that can be used more broadly? So my goal has been to try and take something that was originally not designed to be super flexible, and it was originally designed to be a little 8-bit emulator running Pac-Man or something. It's become this thing that'll run everything from 8-bit CPUs to 64-bit CPUs, that'll run all kinds of stuff down to 3D hardware and simple hardware. It's just this very broad thing. And so this is sort of something I push for, because I'm a software engineer. And as a software engineer, a good architecture, a good software architecture appeals to me. But we're starting with something that maybe it wasn't super well designed to do what it does today. And so we want to kind of take it into that and build a good software architecture out of it. So quick project history, for those who don't know. It started in 97, so that's 11 and a half years. First version was released in early 97. Originally written for DOS, because DOS was the rage back then. But we switched to Windows in 2001. But we've really always been cross-platform. So the whole architecture is designed to be cross-platform. It's designed to be ported. It's gotten better over time, in my opinion. And so if you're on Linux or anything else running SDL Mame is for you. There's this old thing called Xmame. It still gets a lot of press because everybody heard of Xmame back in the day, but it's like 3+ years out of date and don't use it. I mean, unless you like 3-year-old software. And then there's MameOS X for Mac OS 10. It's a little optimized for Mac OS 10. It's got a nice UI. Not Mac Mame, which is where I started. I started on Mac Mame. I was a Mac guy for a number of years. And that's also dead. I'm okay with that. There's been over 100 contributors. So this project is huge. It's grown way out of control. There's hundreds of people who have contributed to it in terms of reverse engineering, in terms of providing knowledge about how these games work, in terms of providing access to games that you've never even heard of before. So there's just a lot of great people who have worked on this. So, I'm currently coordinating the project, but I'm by no means like the guy. So there's lots of other guys out there who deserve, praise or for what they've done there. And our source code has been available from the beginning. And I don't say we're open source because we're not open source, but we're source code available. And for those who want to know the distinction about that, we can talk about that later. So I really want to talk about why is Mame important. This is why it's important to me. And the way I look at Mame is to arcade games as the Library of Congress is to books. Now that may be overstating it a bit, but that's how I like to look at it in my idealized world. So really the thing is, you could say it's really up to the game publishers to ensure that their stuff lives on. But do you really want to leave it up to a bunch of companies that most of them are dead and they're not very good at keeping archives and they're not really objective about what is worth keeping and what's not worth keeping? The Library of Congress kind of serves that role when you look at it. They keep a whole bunch of stuff. They have people who are experts and understand that, and they don't really care what the book publishers want them to keep. They keep what they feel is important, culturally important. So I worked at a game company that actually had good archives. And I still couldn't get stuff out of the archives 10 years after we put it in there. It was nearly impossible. So from my personal experience, I do not believe that game companies as a whole are very good at keeping their own archives. In fact, if you look at almost any emulator that's commercially sent today, if you really kind of dig into it and poke into it a little bit, you'll often find README files that are shipped with ROMs that people have dumped for emulation in Mame, because it's a lot easier for them to go out and get the stuff there than to try and find it in their own archives. And I get at least a couple of calls a year from some guy whose task is to emulate some old game saying, how did this really work? Because even though the companies have indirectly licensed with those guys and talk to them, they didn't actually get real information about how these things work. And so by all the evidence I see, I think it's really important for somebody else to be doing this work. And it's not really in the company's best interest. They want to exploit the stuff that's popular. But to my opinion, for every Pac-Man, there's a hopping Mappy or some other game that you've never heard of before. I know these companies produce tons of games, and a fraction of them were popular. I don't really care. I want to understand all of them, because there's probably a lot of really cool games I'd never even heard of before, and I know that for a fact. In 11 years, I've found so many really neat games. And a commercial emulator must focus on usability over accuracy. So from my opinion, I don't really care if Mame runs a game slowly on the current hardware. Sorry, but I don't. If we do it right, I'd rather do it right and get it right, and then if it's slow, it's slow, and it'll get better because hardware gets better. We'll find better ways of doing things. I have faith in that. However, if you paid for an emulator from a company, you're going to be pissed off if that thing doesn't run well on your system. And so it's in their best interest to cut corners to make things run on lower end systems. And to my mind, that's fine. That's fine. I feel that there's two different areas here. There's people who make commercial emulators, and